I'm our Executive Director of the Rappaport Center for Non-Public Policy here at Boston College Law School, and along with my colleagues, Professor Dan Kemstrom, Faculty Director, and Abigail Chingo, Administrative Assistant. Welcome to today's program. Boston's exam schools are the new admissions policies achieving educational equity. In Boston, there are 3 exam schools: Boston Latin Academy, and the O'Brien School of Math and Science. Did you know that Boston Latin School is the oldest public school in the United States, having been established in April of 1635? And if you go there, and I think this is still true, you are required to take 3 or 4 years of Latin, depending on what grade you enter. Still true. Hence the names. Women were not admitted until 1972. Last week, the Rappaport Center held a program in higher education, looking at the recent Supreme Court cases. And today, we're continuing to tackle the issue of school admissions, diversity, and educational equity. But at this time, we're looking at grade 12. The issue of diversity, particularly racial and ethnic diversity at the BPS exam schools, has engendered. Starting with U.S. District Court Judge Arthur Garager's ruling in 1974 that BPS schools were racially segregated, resulting in the onset of the emotionally fraught busing. Almost 50 years later, the exam schools admissions policies remain steeped in litigation. As we sit here, there's a case pending in the First Circuit Court of Appeals that was just argued this past December. Today, we have brought together an extraordinary panel of scholars, educators, former head of school at BLS, activists, lawyers, and a Boston public school parent, our very own Mary Holper here at the law school, to help us understand how we got where we are today. What are the issues being raised by both proponents and critics? And are the newest set of admissions policies making inroads on the goal of achieving educational equity? I get the privilege of introducing our moderator, Rebekah Coley, who is chair and professor of counseling, developmental, and educational psychology at the Lynch School of Education and director of the Institute of Early Childhood Policy here at Boston College. Rebekah's research looks at economic, social, and racial inequities in mental educational policies and practices in an effort to dismantle of inequities to children, families, and communities. Her research has been published in dozens of leading journals. She's received funding from the National Institutes of Health, as well as numerous private foundations. She's the editor of a published by the Society for Research and Trial Development. She holds leadership positions in multiple professions, notably in recognition of her stellar research. Some years ago, Rebekah received a Fulbright Senior Scholar Award, though really she wasn't old enough to have it be senior, and a social Society for Research in Adolescence. She's a graduate of Brandeis, who received her doctorate at the University of Michigan and did postdoc training at the University of Chicago. And just to add to her remarkable credentials, she's also a member of the Rappaport Center Advisory Board. Please welcome Rebekah.
Thank you, Lindsay, for that lovely introduction. It is a pleasure and an honor that all of you legal scholars allow educators and psychologists to come and communicate with you and have this kind of two-way debate and conversation. We're really looking forward to it. So this issue, the exam schools both in Boston and around the country are issues that are really gaining attention in relation to concerns about equity and diversity and who gets access to the highest quality educational opportunities in our country. So this is relevant not only for Boston, but really for cities and states around the country. So we have 4 panelists today. I am going to introduce them one at a time and then ask each of them to spend about 5 minutes talking about how the issue of exam schools intersects with their professional work and or their personal lives and their experiences. And then we will have questions from the audience and from me as well. So we look forward to the conversation. We are going to start with Melanie Rucinski, who is a doctoral candidate at Harvard Kennedy School, studying K-12 educational policies. She published with her colleague Goodman just last year a seminal study on the Boston exam schools, looking at racial and ethnic disparities in exam school access and entree. She also has worked, she's currently working with the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, looking at diversity among K-12 educators and linking that diversity to diversity in school, educational attainment and success among children. Her prior work has looked at barriers to racial diversity in exam schools and other schools in Massachusetts and around the country. So we welcome Melanie and again ask her to speak for about 5 minutes about her work.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for having me. I actually grew up in Newton, so this work is somewhat close to home for me. But I first got connected to the exam schools when I was working as a research assistant several years ago at the Kennedy School for Josh Goodman. And we were connected to the exam schools by Steve Koptak, who at the time was the executive director of the Rappaport Institute at the Harvard Kennedy School. And he approached us with this observation that I think a lot of people were familiar with at the time, that the exam schools in Boston just don't look like Boston public schools in terms of the demographics of their enrollment. So at the time, the statistic was that about 75% of students in Boston public schools were Black or Hispanic. But at the exam schools, that number was only 40%. And at Boston Latin School, which is the most selective, but also the largest of the 3 schools, only 20% of students were Black or Hispanic. And if you asked people in Boston in the school why this gap existed between the public schools and the exam schools, they would have a lot of different explanations. So people would often point to the admissions test, which was considerably more advanced than the Massachusetts state curriculum. It was also administered on a Saturday in Boston, which I often say, if you've ever tried to get anywhere in Boston by public transit on a weekend, you understand why that might be a barrier to students. People would also point to racial gaps in GPA within the Boston public schools or between the public schools and the private schools among students who were applying to these schools, or just racial gaps in preferences over the school. So for any reason, like students may just not want to attend the exam schools, or people often would theorize that that Black or Hispanic students might not want to attend Boston Latin School at the same rate as white and Asian students because of the location of the school, because it was in the news often about its racial climate, things of that nature. So our goal with this research was to take these gaps that people propose might exist and see if we could quantify them and maybe ask which of these gaps, if any, were most important in driving the overall lack of diversity at the exam schools. And what we found when we did this was essentially that everyone was right. So there were racial gaps at every stage of the admissions pipeline. Black and Hispanic students were less likely to take the admissions test than white and Asian students. They scored lower on the test, they did have lower GPAs, and they were less likely to rank Boston Latin School as their first choice. And all of these gaps existed even among students who had the highest scores on the state test. And in fact, the only stages where we did not see gaps were that if they were invited to attend the school, so if they were admitted, Black and Hispanic students were just as likely as white and Asian students to attend the schools. They were also just as likely to remain enrolled through 12th grade. So only at the very end of the pipeline do we not see gaps. Everywhere before that, there are racial gaps. And another sense in which everyone was kind of right about this was that no single gap is really most important in driving the overall lack of diversity at the schools. So we run simulations where we say, if you could wave a magic wand and close the gap in who's taking the test or their scores or any one of these stages in isolation, that's really not going to affect diversity at the end of the pipeline very much. Instead, what we find is that the simulations that have the most effect are things like switching the admissions test to use the state test instead of the privately administered exam, or maybe switching to an admission system that's going to admit a certain percentage of students from each school based on their state test scores. And so these are interventions that would really be addressing multiple gaps in the pipeline at once, which is why we're able to see a bigger potential effect from these interventions. So I think there are two kind of takeaways that I have from this work. So one is that I think a reason why the work was able to have the impact that it did is that it took something that everybody sort of already knew, but put it in publicly available numbers and data and evidence that policymakers and advocates could use to be speaking a common language when they were working towards solutions on this issue. So I think formalizing that and making it available and clearly comprehensible was a big contribution of this work. But the other thing that I often say about this work is that the lack of racial diversity at exam schools in Boston, in New York, in Chicago, in San Francisco, in Virginia, these are the systemic problems that exist in Boston and elsewhere. And systemic problems require systemic solutions. And so I think another thing that was somewhat fortuitous about this work was that we released it for the first time just a few years before the COVID pandemic, which created an opportunity for policymakers in Boston and elsewhere to start really rethinking the systems that lead to this kind of systemic problem. And that's something that just may not have happened if this work had been released at a different time. And so I'll turn it back over to, I think Tanisha is next, and she'll be able to speak a little bit to how that systems change happened in Boston.
Thank you, Melanie. So I would next like to introduce Tanisha Sullivan. Perhaps most relevantly for the current situation, she is a member of the Rappaport Center Advisory Board with me. She has lots of other positions beyond that, though. She is president of the NAACP in the Boston branch. The NAACP Boston branch is a leading voice on issues of racial diversity, economic justice, equity and opportunity in public education, and the elimination of health disparities in and around the city of Boston. Her day job beyond those two tasks are as the Associate General Counsel to a biotech company in Cambridge. Prior to that, she was in corporate law, and including spending 2 years as a senior policy role with the Boston Public School District as the Chief Equity Officer. So she is going to talk to us about the admissions process and how it has shifted in the Boston exam schools since she was a key player of the committees that created the new policies.
Good afternoon. All right. Good afternoon. Actually, there's another very relevant piece of information that you, if you don't know, you really should know, especially as I see Professor Rowe in the back there, right, making me incredibly nervous. I am a very proud alum of Boston College Law School and Boston College Carroll School of Management. I did a joint JD MBA while I was here, and I have to say, the experience, and my dad's a BC alum, my brother's a BC alum, my sister-in-law, like, I'm just saying, okay? So truly, BC and the spirit of BC, the mission and purpose of BC really has played an important role in many of the decisions I've made from a career standpoint and also a community standpoint. Men and women for others is not just, they aren't just words for me. They really are how I try to live my life. And so much of who I am and what I do is rooted here. And so it's wonderful to be here. I appreciate Lissy for always, for her invitations, and I always say yes when Lissy calls. So this is good. And I love this topic. So a few things just to level set. Boston Public Schools, as folks heard earlier, right? We went through a rather tumultuous period coming through the civil rights movement. that led to ultimately forced desegregation of Boston Public Schools through the 1974 desegregation order. What folks oftentimes don't talk about is that exam schools, through the evolution of kind of the implementation of that order, were called out from the standpoint of needing to be desegregated. And actually up until 1990, that felt weird. 1997, eons ago, actually, you know, embedded in the admissions process were affirmative steps to ensure that there was racial and ethnic diversity in the schools, okay? Up until 1997. It's important to note also that while the school was founded in 1635, it wasn't until 1963 that an exam actually became part of the process for admissions. Okay. 2 points, because I do think they should play a role in how we understand the full context of what these schools are, what they represent, and how people get into them. Let's not miss that in 1963, the political ecosystem, right, in this country as it relates to the civil rights movement. Okay, so keep that in mind. And I think that's important whenever we're talking about public policy, the kind of the social context in which we advance public policy does play an important role in how we might think about public policy solutions. Okay. So I want to thank Melanie and Josh Goodman for their work in 2018 because it did have really an important impact from a policy standpoint within Boston Public Schools. It led to the district making a decision to actually change the type of assessment used in the admissions process. So we went from using the IC exam, which was not aligned with the Boston Public Schools curriculum, to making a decision that we were going to introduce the use of the MAP assessment, which is another assessment that is aligned with the Boston Public Schools curriculum. So it gave really Boston Public Schools students a fairer shot at being able to demonstrate through this assessment that they were prepared for an exam school. That happened early 2020, late 2019, early 2020. And then we get a global public health pandemic. Okay, and schools are closed. And then they open, and then they close again, and then they're hybrid, and then they're all, right? Okay, so we remember that context. I got a call in, I think it was June of 2020 from the then chair of the Boston School Committee and the superintendent and the mayor, asking if we, through the NAACP, would be willing to help them think about exam school admissions in the context of a global public health pandemic. I initially said no. Right, Rachel, you said no. Really, this is a setup. Okay, but you know, when you get a call from, you know, those three individuals, you ultimately say yes. And understanding again, the importance of the question and the solution for the moment, and most importantly for our students. So in 2020, we spent the summer of 2020, Rachel was on this journey with me. So we spent the summer of 2020 really wrestling with the question about exam school admissions and what they could look like. Forget about what they should look like, what they could look like against the backdrop of the global public health pandemic, where we knew that students who were in Boston Public Schools had a very disrupted learning experience through the pandemic. We also knew that children from lower income communities were not getting, you know, they weren't in the bubbles, you know, having like the tutoring and being able to continue their learning like some of their more wealthy peers. Like these are the things we knew. And then there was just a practical question of, Like, are we really sending thousands of children into a building to take a test when we're saying that people should be working remotely? Okay, so ultimately in 2020, we introduced an interim policy. That interim policy was really designed to ensure that the pool of students who were eligible to be selected had, on the best we could, on some level, demonstrated that they were ready to enter into a rigorous learning environment. And we'll talk more about kind of how we got to this point, but we landed on grades and/or MCAS scores. The point was, how can we best determine if a student is ready for this type of learning environment? That's the pool. Okay. And then we had this question about selection. With all of the factors that we knew going into this conversation about access, and quite frankly, with what all that COVID had exposed and helped more people to understand about fairness and access, period, we looked at this interim policy as a potential opportunity for us to think differently about selection. How could we ensure that these citywide schools, because all 3 exam schools are citywide, they're not neighborhood schools, they're citywide schools, were more representative of the city and the children living in the city as a result of this process? And so we came up with a selection process that was twofold. One, there was a citywide selection process where the top 20% of students citywide gained access, were given an invitation to the schools. And then the remaining 80% of the seats were allocated across the neighborhoods. Okay. And again, available data, Melanie, thank you. Data mattered. I mean, we were under mounds and mounds of data. Okay. And so we chose at that point in time to use zip codes to get us to neighborhoods, so that we could, with the remaining 80%, look at the top performing students within specific neighborhoods, okay? That was the interim policy, very oversimplified, okay? That went through our working group, it went through our city council, was unanimous of city council. School committee was unanimously adopted by the school committee. And was challenged, as we heard, in federal district court. The NAACP Boston branch intervened in that case. And so we are interveners and actively involved in that case. Judge Young at the lower court level did rule in our favor. It has so far through the judicial process, the interim policy has been upheld and allowed to move on. It is currently sitting in the First Circuit of Appeals. We're expecting a decision hopefully this quarter. Okay. Very soon after we finished, we spent our summer going through that process. Several of us were then asked to continue on to look at a permanent policy for our exam schools. For that process, I was asked to co-chair alongside Michael Contemplasis, who is a longtime Boston Public Schools educator. He was a former head of Boston Latin School, very well respected in the education space. And again, said no. I think Mike said no too, but we ended up doing it. So we then were tasked with making a proposal for a permanent policy. Okay. That permanent policy ended up, I'm going to fast forward, where we landed with the permanent policy was, we did make a recommendation that there would be an assessment. Okay. That was a heavy debate. So yes, assessment. Okay. To help create the pool, right? Yes to grades to help create the pool, but on grades, we expanded the courses that would be factored into kind of the average for the grades. And on selection, we made some tweaks. We made major changes. Okay. On the selection part, after reviewing what has been done across the country in selective school admissions processes, reviewing the robust research that has been done here locally, where we land, and taking into consideration that the interim policy actually did some amazing things with respect to demographics. We had an increase in, the very first time, the representation of students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds into our exam schools, an increase in English language learners accepted into exam schools, an increase in students with disabilities invited to exam schools, an increase in Asian, Latinx, and Black students receiving invitations into the exam schools. And I want to double down on that, Asian, Latinx, and Black, because there's been a lot of misinformation out there that says that Asian students were disproportionately impacted, adversely impacted by this policy. Not true. The data is very clear on that, okay? So those were interesting data points for us. So we want to see, well, what can we do? So in selection with the permanent policy, here's how it goes. We used kind of a modified, if you will, Chicago model. And we divided students into census tracts versus zip codes. Census tracts get you more closer to a representation on an economic base, okay, for families. We would have loved to do individual, but that level of data is not available, okay? So we use census tracts. And our recommendation was that seats be allocated within census tracts. So what you have is students from similar socioeconomic backgrounds, as best we could with the data available, were competing for seats against students from similar socioeconomic backgrounds. Okay. All of them have gone through the process to get into the pool. So they've done an assessment. They've demonstrated that in the classroom they've performed. When it came to selection, they are now competing for seats with their neighbors, okay? There again, went to the city council. That too was adopted by our city council in 2021. We're now a full year into this process, two summers. July of 2021, the school committee adopted this particular policy with a couple of caveats. One, there would be no assessment in 2021 again, because we're still coming out of COVID. And two, probably one of the most interesting and unique aspects of this policy in comparison to what we've seen in other parts of the country. They adopted our recommendation to give additional points to two categories of two tracks of students. One, students who were significantly economically disadvantaged. So we're talking about students who are homeless, students living in public housing, and students who were in the care and custody of DCF. Those students would receive additional points, recognizing the trauma and disruption that they were experiencing in this process. The second track were students who were in schools that had upwards of 40% or more students who were economically disadvantaged or living in poverty. Those students were also eligible for additional points. Important fact. Every tier, every economic tier in the new policy has students receiving additional points. Every tier. There's not a tier that doesn't have students receiving additional points. Important point, okay? So where we land is a policy that emerged out of crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, that has really flipped Boston Public Schools on its head when it comes to exam school admissions, while at the same time is really laying, I think, kind of new groundwork for what selective school admissions and exam school admissions might look like across the country going forward, of course, contingent upon the outcome of these pending lawsuits. With that, I'm going to turn it back over.
Thank you. All right, so we have heard about the research, we've heard about the policy shifts that led to these changes in the exam school selection process. Now we are going to hear more from sort of the front lines of working in and running these schools. So our next speaker is Rachel Skerritt. She attended Boston Latin School. Then she was an English teacher at Boston Latin School, and then she was the BPS Chief of Staff from 2009 to 2010, and the head of school at Boston Latin School for 5 years. In addition to all of those roles, she also has a BA from the University of Pennsylvania, numerous master's degrees from a large number of different schools, from the University of Penn, UMass, and Georgetown University. And currently is a Chief Strategy Officer at the Attuned Education Partners. So Rachel.
Thank you so much, Rebekah. It's a pleasure to be here and my first BC panel, and I'm happy to come back if Lizzie calls me, but I am not going after Tanisha again. Always be last. It is so difficult. I don't know how you managed to summarize 2 long summers of our life so succinctly and eloquently. I will do my best. My thoughts are a little more scattered, as school implementation does tend to be. I'm tasked with kind of sharing with you all what happened after we did the tough work and work that we're really proud of together with folks who didn't all have the same perspectives. And really made what is, of course, an imperfect plan, because if there were a perfect one, we wouldn't have spent 2 summers doing it. But as Tanisha said, has really been a seismic shift in access, particularly for my alma mater, which is Boston Latin School. When Rebekah had said, to talk about kind of the professional and personal intersections with these schools, and I know that my entire trajectory of life was affected by my enrollment in Boston Latin School for the better. So it's always extremely personal as someone who is a first-generation college student, first-generation American, to really prioritize that there are seats at all 3 exam schools for students to have that opportunity. I think that an important point to remember, and Melanie just also really well referenced so many of the reasons that there is this racial gap in access. And I think one reason that maybe we could explore a little bit more is school quality K through 6. We are, for all intents and purposes, still in a segregated school district. Outside of the exam schools, the majority of schools in Boston are very predominantly Black and brown. And have high levels of low socioeconomic status. And all schools are doing their working their absolute hardest, loving students, really caring for them, especially in these years after the pandemic. But curricula varies widely, rigor varies widely, teacher quality varies widely, teacher retention, all of those things. When I think of when I arrived at BLS, as a student in 1989, it wasn't until I got to college and read Savage Inequalities by Jonathan Kozol that I realized really how precarious and lucky my path was to Boston Latin School, which also dictated my path to the University of Pennsylvania. I only discovered Penn because an alum of Latin School paid for kids to spend the summer there between junior and senior year, and that was how that school opened for me. So literally my entire life impacted by my grade 7 seat at BLS, which was dictated by a test that I took in 3rd grade. And I was young for my grade, so I was 7, to gain access to the advanced work class program in Boston that began in grade 4. From there, I had to change schools, move over to that advanced work class, go up to 4th and 5th grade, then go to another advanced work class for 6th grade. At which time, all of us in the class then went to the exam school. And so again, trajectory of my life determined by a test taken in grade 7. I mean, at age 7 in grade 3. So I just wanted to give that perspective because there is just so much precariousness in the system right now. And for students and families, as I know we'll hear more about, it's a lot to think about. But going back to how things are going. First of all, I really appreciate that Tanisha mentioned that there's so many admissions policies that the exam schools have seen over the years. And for most of their existences, there was no exam. It was teacher recommendations, phone calls, letters of recommendations, other things. When I attended BLS, it was a very racially diverse school. I was attending under the system that Tanisha mentioned, where there was a set aside quota system for Black and Latinx students to be admitted. It was a time at BLS where there was representation of all identity groups. There was not a situation very often where you were sitting in a class as the only of any identity group. When I assumed the school leadership position in 2017, that was far from the case. And there were often Black and Latinx students representing as not only just the only student in a specific class, but it could also be the only student in a specific orchestra or the only student in a specific club or sport, et cetera, which has tremendous socioeconomic, social emotional effects on one's experience in high school, as I imagine some folks here may have even experienced. It does make me proud to hear Melanie, as somber as that pipeline loss process is, to hear as the person charged with leading and meeting the kids for the first time when they arrived to us, that is where the pipeline did become more equitable. And we are extremely proud that our students of color are graduating at the same rate, are matriculating college at the same rate, completing colleges at rates that far exceed national averages in terms of Black and Latinx students across all socioeconomic demographics. So that part is great to hear. So I should also mention, I am not the head of school this year, and so head of school Jason Gallagher has the most recently admitted class because we had 2 different interim policies. So when I share anecdotally some of the experiences with the first class of admitted students, it was the first interim policy, which used zip codes for the geographic diversity. And yeah, so, and then I should also just mention that when the students are admitted for this coming class, we have 6 grade levels at BLS, grades 7 through 12. We will have within that one cohort of students who were admitted by 4 different exam school policies. And we are still thriving, and also to remember, this is the year of the 50th anniversary of women. So we've been doing some fun historical searching, and there is a lot of histrionic ire from people in the newspaper 50 years ago, like, what's going to happen to our precious school? Women. Well, there are now more girls at BLS, and they're more often in the top of the class than the young men. And so again, these schools persist despite this worry around student quality, which is frankly oftentimes offensive. And history proves that students, when given the right supports and love, will rise to the challenge. And that's what we're seeing with our students at this in this early stage. The students arrived, and I'll just talk about our 7th graders because that's the larger cohort. We do admit 9th graders as well, but a much smaller group. They came to BLS, immediately fell in love with it to the point where they often wouldn't leave the building at 5, 6 o'clock. They just really immediately took to the pace, the energy of the place, the number of activities that they could join. We have 60+ athletic teams, over 150 clubs, lots of different affinity groups and other things. But it was a tough transition. And I think what folks forget is because everyone remembers this class as a class that got in without having taken an assessment, everyone attributed the tough transition to that. This was the class that was coming in person to Latin school, already a huge transition, 3 hours of homework a night, 7 periods a day, 6 major subjects, etc. They were doing that after spending a year on their Chromebooks. A critical year, middle school, 6th grade, the first year of middle school, where you're making different friends, you're forging relationships, you're being an adolescent. They had all of that strictly through their phones. And so a lot of the challenges last year were really about maturity levels, adaptation, etc. When we actually look at the student performance data, such as the state MCAS testing last year, that cohort actually performed identically to the current 10th grade students who were admitted under the former policy on the ELA MCAS. On math MCAS, they did perform slightly less than typical, but again, they had a critical year of their math instruction on a laptop, right? It also goes back and speaks to the dramatic difference in school curriculum and rigor across the over 100 sending schools that we have in one school. We typically offer pre-algebra as the baseline math class that all 7th graders at BLS take, unless they test up into Algebra 1 in grade 7. And we realize that it doesn't matter your brilliance if you have not actually been taught specific math content that makes you ready for pre-algebra. So we did need to institute some pre-algebra courses that will then put students on track to begin Algebra 1 in grade 9 instead of grade 8. Which actually is not a new program for us because some of the students who come into us in grade 9 already do that. But just an example of one adjustment we made. We also used federal ESSER funding and our partnership with the Latin School Association, which is our nonprofit organization that supports the school. And we placed significant funding into a data-driven, invitation-only process for a very intense after-school program. What we realized is that one of the markers between students who were doing well immediately and students who weren't was not their academic ability, but their experience with work habits. For some students, it was their first time ever receiving homework. It was their first time ever having to do work outside of the school day. And so what we realized was a lot of the reasons for their low grades in their transcripts were because of failure to turn in assignments, missing assignments, incomplete assignments. And so if we can hold on to the students until 6 p.m. and they can do it under our watch, we watch the playing field become a lot more level. So I'll leave that at that. The last thing I'll just say is some considerations for the future. There was a lot to implement at once and BPS is doing its best. A few things I think we should consider. Admissions used to come out to students in March and their families. It's been April the last couple of years. It's extremely challenging as the school landscape in other contexts, independent schools, et cetera, is all March. When we think about wanting to capture as many students as possible across identity groups, we need to get that timeline back. So parents have to make decisions. And so I think that that's just an implementation challenge we should think about. I think thinking about the uneven subjectivity of grades is something that the district has to face in terms of, are there universal grading expectations? What does it mean that there are some tiers that have hundreds and hundreds of students with an A average, and we have other tiers that don't actually have enough students in them with a B average to fill up the number of exam school seats that we've offered? Is that grade inflation? Is that teacher subjectivity? Is that student attendance? That should be explored. And I think that, among many other questions, are some of the things that we committed to as a working group to come back and re-examine some of the aspects of the policy in the future to just see what continues to need to be looked at. And the last example of that I'll give is the good one that Tanisha mentioned about additional points for students who attend schools with low socioeconomic populations. I remember when that idea came up, and it was really thinking about those schools that had honestly very rarely sent students to a BLS. Schools that had upwards of 80% of students who had low SES status. And I do wonder if the 40% threshold is reaching the students who most need it. And did it go so low that you have students who don't actually have any barriers to access receiving points, and other students who have significant barriers but go to one of the 5 BPS schools that don't get points, what's that really doing? And it's hard to analyze that in the aggregate when we're just celebrating the new shifts in diversity, which are great. I think we need to do a deeper dive and take a look once we finally get to this permanent policy. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I would also add that the pattern you noted about math scores and math skills declining far more than reading skills. It's a pattern that we see across the country, across the state and across the country, and among advantaged students as well as disadvantaged students. So clearly there's growing evidence that school is very important for math skills. And that language art skills can be learned in a broader variety of contexts. So our last speaker is Mary Holper. She will be familiar to many of you. She is the Associate Dean for Experiential Learning and Director of the Immigration Clinic and an Associate Clinical Professor here at the BC Law School. Prior to that, she was an Associate Professor at Roger Williams University School of Law, and she has an extensive career in immigration rights, scholarship, and litigation. She also, however, given that this is not a panel on immigration, is a parent of 2 BPS students who are just actually at the age where they're moving into this question of where they will be going to middle school and high school. So she will be speaking of her personal experience of being a parent of BPS students.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. And I'm glad that you mentioned that because I feel like everyone's like, what are you doing on this panel? It makes absolutely no sense. I'm not your area of expertise. So I'm not here as a lawyer. I'm here as a very proud BPS parent. And first of all, I really want to commend Tanisha and Rachel for the 2 summers of hard work that you put into this because it is so important and so key and critical. And it's an example of something so positive coming from something so negative, which is the pandemic. And I love that it brings the best educational opportunities that BPS has to offer to kids whose communities have suffered harms caused by our government, such as redlining, blockbusting policies that basically created urban neighborhoods of concentrated poverty as the only place where people of color could live and could not exit, such as discrimination of all kinds that these kids' parents, grandparents, and other mentors have suffered throughout their careers, such as the war on drugs that took away countless members of the communities who would otherwise be mentors to these students, and such as the school to prison pipeline that targeted these kids as more likely to land in jail than college because of the color of their skin and because of the neighborhood that they came from. So I just want to applaud the work for making that happen because this is a way to correct a lot of historical wrongs that have happened in Boston. So thank you. No, that wasn't easy, and it's even worse when then you get somebody challenging it in a lawsuit. As an administrator, I can appreciate all the hard work that everyone's like, that's terrible, you did it all wrong. So thank you for all the work. So I'm also a BPS parent, as mentioned. My kids are in 5th grade. I have twins, and this means that this whole policy will be impacting our lives a year from now. And this is where I hope that we can test our values. And this is why I asked Lizzie to put together this panel, because I was like, you, the law students, many don't have kids yet, or if you do, they're very little and you haven't made your school choices yet. So I think we need to think critically about this. I think we need to think critically about this sort of like march to the suburbs that we have all made just as like a foregone conclusion. And it's my hope that this new policy that we as privileged parents recognize, it means our kids are less likely to be admitted. I mean, I live in tier 8. I have looked at the map. My kids do attend. It's interesting that last comment about my kids do attend a school that has over 40% of the kid that is poor enough that they would earn the extra 10 points, but we don't need it. We're basically, we don't need the advantage so we're basically in the same boat as the Elliott School, which is a school where there's enough wealthy families who've gone there that the kids wouldn't earn the 10 points. So that's been very controversial, and it is something that happens to be benefiting my kids in the current policy. So, the critical questions that I think we have to ask is, is it really like the exam schools are bust? And really, the question is more drilled down, is it BLS or bust? Because they're all like, oh, it's Boston Latin School or bust. You can't get in there, you're out of there. You leave. You go to Newton, where, by the way, I work and so does my husband. So that would be much more convenient for your lives, right? You go to Newton. Or you go to an independent school, a private school. I mean, that's basically what, and I can tell you that this conversation happens over and over and over and over and over when you are a parent whose kids are nearing the school ages. And so it causes us to question why we don't send our kids to global majority schools. That would be a school where the bulk of the kids are Black and brown. What are we afraid of are those schools? What are our fears? Why do we why do we insist that our kids must be surrounded and have friends that are only kids of privilege, just like us? Because that's basically the underlying concern that you hear over and over and over again. And so as I've been doing a lot of reading on this topic. This is like when I don't do reading about immigration, I'm reading about, the integrated schools movement. And there's a couple really great readings that I suggested to go out there. Nicole Hannah-Jones has a wonderful New York Times Magazine article called Choosing a School for My Daughter in a Segregated City. Courtney Martin is in Oakland, and she wrote a whole book about this. And it's called Learning in Public, Lessons for a Racially Divided America from My Daughter's School. And they basically put into words some of the feelings that I was already having, because my kids are at a global majority school. The ethnic breakdown at my kids' school is 38% Latinx, 30% Black, 20% white, 7% Asian, and 5% students of 2 or more races. It actually tracks the numbers of school-age children in Boston pretty closely. And 80% of the students at my kids' school are a low enough socioeconomic status that they qualify for free lunch. Okay, so this is what the integrated schools movement would say. There's a smog that we breathe. They borrowed this from, if you've read Why Are All the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria, the smog we breathe. Okay, and the smog that we breathe, that I breathe, from other suburban parent friends when considering a school, you can't send your kids to Boston Public Schools. From the parents who live in Boston, you can, but only these schools. Only the ones where all the wealthy people have concentrated. From other Boston friends, look at the test scores. They are so low. How can you go to that school? It just seems so chaotic. I'm worried that my child will not be safe. Okay, these are the things that we hear, and it's not a joke. These are the things that I've heard over and over and over again at the YMCA, at swim lessons, at parks in the neighborhood, at you name it, any conversation where the school topic comes up, almost to the point where I'm like, I just don't want to talk about schools. I just don't want to go there because it really boils my blood, because it sort of suggests, and this is where Courtney Martin, in her very long book on this, she identified as a journalist all of these conversations and all of these concerns from parents as she's making her own school choices for her own daughter when she is facing a decision about whether to send her daughter to a global majority school in Oakland. And so what she hears, one thing she hears is that the privileged parent's sole purpose in sending their child to a global majority school is to do good, save the school. But of course, that carries with it a risk that the privileged parents are casting themselves in the role of white savior, there to save a failing school without any recognition of the benefits that that school can bring to their child, and the assets of that school and that community. The second thing that she hears is that liberal parents are told they should not turn their kid into an experiment by making a school decision based on their political values of integration. And she writes that no doubt Lucille Bridges, mother of little Ruby Bridges, may have heard this once or twice by sending her child to an unsafe educational environment where she'd be the only Black child attempting to integrate, and their family would receive death threats as a result. But she persisted because she saw it as a generational journey, and that integration shouldn't have to be a one-way street. And it's not only the Black children who have to dive into the proverbial deep end. The third thing, the majority Black and brown schools seem chaotic or dangerous. This is where we have to worry about the racist tropes that are growing around in our minds. When we see in particular high school sized bodies of color all in one place, doing things that high schoolers do, like yell, sing loudly, push each other around because they're joking. And that we have decided that white teenagers doing the exact same activity is less chaotic, more safe, and totally fine for our kids to be friends with. But that whole group of Black kids doing it, not so safe, very chaotic, very dangerous for children. In fact, the statistics show, Nicole Hannah-Jones says this, that among white parents or privileged parents, if there aren't at least 26% of the kids in the school who are white, they don't even consider it as a possibility. So the fourth thing is that privileged parents should be afraid of the kids mingling with the very poor, the baggage that they might bring. But of course, this is all about making group predictions about everyone, you know, every single one of our child's future friends without any context, any knowledge of what those kids actually are. And then of course, it forgets that there might be group predictions we could make about the very wealthy. Like concentration of wealth can lead to some really entitled bratty behavior. Maybe I don't want my kids to be friends with those kids. You know, massive amounts of anxiety that kids might feel when they have to live up to their parents' expectations if the parents are at the top of their field. Maybe I don't want my kids to be friends with those kids. I'm just saying, these are like the categories and the generalizations, and they seem to only work in one direction and not in the other. So I know that I've talked with a lot of my students before about this, and you know, others like, okay, does this lead to white flight? Does this mean that like every single parent of privilege leaves the city if their kids don't get a spot at BLS or one of the exam schools? And I guess my answer is no, because the fact of the matter is that I have a law degree from here, so does my husband. We have been doing what essentially amounts to homeschooling for many, many years. I mean, other than the obvious homeschooling that happened at the beginning of the pandemic, like the real, like, all right, at 10:45, we will do this, and at 11:30, we'll do this. Like, we have been taking them to museums. We have been reading to them all throughout their lives. We have been doing all the work, and it's not as though our kids' privilege is going to get stripped away by attending a school where the majority of the kids are poor, or Black and brown, which tends to correlate because of our nation's history. So that's just the challenge that I open up to. And I don't have this conversation with every single parent because it could be exhausting when you're just trying to get my kid changed and leaving the YMCA after swim lessons or whatever it is, because you don't always want to get into it. But I just want to invite that conversation, especially for those of you who haven't really made your choices about or don't have kids yet in schools, that these are the things that people face. And there tends to be these like, everybody has to herd to the suburbs, or like, of course you have to do that, or of course, and I'm like, no, you don't have to. That's not a foregone conclusion. There are other options here. And there's a lot of writings and thinking out there that have already been done about how to think about this issue. So anyway, so that's where I want to leave off my comments here.
Thank you very much. All right, we are going to move along to questions. I would love to invite questions from the audience.
Hi, first of all, thank you for organizing this event. I found it very informative. I think it's important to listen to various points of view. That's something I got from being a student at Boston Latin School. In full disclosure, I am part of the group that is taking legal action against the changes that have been made. And part of my concern is that there is very much an idea to fix what's not broken. Boston Latin School, along with the other exam schools, first of all, it must be said that they're not interchangeable. And they're not for everyone. But saying that they're not for everyone doesn't mean that not every student is worthy, talented, intelligent. It is not deserving of a quality, excellent education. I wish Ms. Sullivan, and I thank you for your time today, I wish you would have put as much energy into addressing the feeder schools. Ms. Skerritt, again, I thank you for your time too. I see that you referred to the issues with the feeder schools, but I don't see that you've done much to address them. We have gross problems with the Boston Public Schools. Boston Public Schools, for those of you who might not know, have been fending off a receivership. So what is my point? My point is leave the exam schools as they are. Understand that we have some very intelligent students that are not necessarily going to thrive in the exams. Again, are not interchangeable. What we need are excellent schools at every step of the way. And when we get to secondary education, what we need, we need a constellation of schools that will accommodate our students who are varied and diverse, not necessarily just in race and ethnicity, but also in talent, and yes, political beliefs and intellectual pursuits. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
You can talk from here.
Yeah, you're right.
Thank you. I absolutely agree with you that we need a portfolio of excellent schools. I also appreciate the belief in the power of Latin school alum that from my position as head of school and now not working for BPS that I consult the feeder schools. So that's a huge compliment, but thank you. I think leaving the exam schools as they are, that term, or we can just talk about BLS to your point, they are very distinct, but I do actually want to say, wearing my BPS parent hat, that I would feel very comfortable and excited to send my son to any of the 3 exam schools. And I do also agree that they're very different. And so thinking about what kind of experiences you want your young person to have, do you want them to take Latin or not, should be a factor in where they go. But when you say leave the school as they are, I think we have to go back to the fact that it has been a very dynamic, always changing and evolving school context. I'm not sure exactly what year that you completed, but I can promise you that the demographics before this, right before this shift, were dramatically different from your BLS experience. There's a Shetty study that just came out recently that the biggest indicator of potential for economic advancement from poverty is the social engagement with folks across class groups. Latin school, when we were students, represented that opportunity in really critical ways that benefited all students, including students like Mary's kids. And we evolved to a place, one, because Boston's become so expensive to live that we do have fewer kids in poverty living in a lot of neighborhoods, but also we evolved to a place where 1 in 5 students in BLS resided in the same neighborhood. So to say that the school is not broken is true, because Sumas Primi, I carry a lot of purple pride in terms of our school community, but to say that it cannot be improved to achieve the goals that alumni do boast about. You meet some of our most successful alums and they talk about how they came to BLS with almost nothing, that their parents had nothing, that this school represented an opportunity to propel them into a different space, to make a difference in this world. To presume that 5 years ago, we were in a state where that could not be examined and improved is, I think, flawed.
Well, it's a good thing I didn't mention what's going on now in the exam schools and the stories that parents who want, I'm sorry, good education for everybody, what's going on now.
So let me know.
It's probably a lot of what Mary described in terms of students who don't exactly look the same way, pushing each other around in the hallways and having a good time. There are a lot of rumors and things that are being said that really speak to the fear of change and the historic racism in the city and country. So I would say, as the person who has spent single-handedly the most number of hours in that building in the last 5 years, that I would encourage folks to ask and explore if there is something that they read on Facebook versus the lived experience of the excellence that we live through every day.
Thank you for your response.
So I just want to follow up for you who are interested in one piece that Rachel said about Chetty's work. It's Raj Chetty, an economist at Harvard, who has published really seminal work about economic mobility in the US and the importance of neighborhoods for children's economic mobility and the importance of school quality for economic mobility.
We have a question from the Malden City Council, a student here.
Hi, everyone. Melanie. I'm a product of Malden Public Schools. I can testify, the diversity of Malden in Malden High School right now is 24% white, 22% black, 28% Latino, and 24% Asian. I personally benefit from having such equitable diversity. And I think it is something that has enriched my life and has made me go places and feel comfortable in rooms that I don't think everyone has the same chance to, if they don't have that same type of experience. So it's very valuable. I think that one of the things that we're facing in Malden, and I think a lot of the public schools in Boston are also, is the Chapter 70 formula in Massachusetts is failing our students. And I do hope that in addition to making sure that the exam schools are diversified, public schools that are not necessarily exam schools get the same type of funding that allows students to exceed in those environments. To hear that you have a scholarship to go see when you can, that's fascinating. If we can develop that type of caliber in every public school, Massachusetts will be the nation. Thank you.
So I want to jump in on that and appreciate you bringing Malden into the space. Of course, another BC alum, our Senator Markey reminds me of that every time I speak with him. So I appreciate that. I want to just pick up and I want to really double down on this piece around socioeconomics, because it really does matter. I mean, the research is clear on this point, and we see it play out practically, right, in our schools. That said, when it comes to policy making, especially in the educational equity space, for me personally, I'm consistently looking for opportunities to increase socioeconomic diversity. Like that is one of my key drivers. And it's one of the things, again, for me with this policy that that I really do think we got right. I really believe that you know, being very intentional about the experiences that not just lower income, but students, children living in poverty have in educational learning environments, being very intentional about how we take into consideration the disruptions, the trauma that they face, and yet they still rise in the classroom, right? Yet they are still, remember in this policy, there's a pool, like you gotta get in the pool. Right? You gotta have like that, you know, a certain grade GPA, well, they don't have, you have to have a certain grade average, right? To even get in the pool. And so with this policy, I do think we got that, we have that a lens in the right place. And I'd like to see more policies that speak to fairness and justice focused on the socioeconomic piece. I also want to go back to something that Rachel shared earlier, and I want to make sure we didn't miss it. Because I think it's true about the selective schools, the exam schools, but it's also just generally true about education. So many of the decisions about children and their ability to learn, their ability to be successful happens early in their learning journey, 3rd grade, right? And so I do, and when we look at the data, what the data tells us is that, you know, in many of our urban public school districts, Boston included, children, our ELA scores are incredibly low when it comes to proficiency. And so I do believe we need to think about, from a policy standpoint, interruptions earlier in the learning journey to help ensure that regardless of where a child ends up, whatever seat they end up in when they get to 9th grade, like that they are ready to, that we've prepared them and that they're ready to learn in any environment. We've got a lot of work to do there.
We have more questions. That's what room BLS. So come on.
Yeah, I'm not one of the distinguished.
All I hear in my head is Panoya.
I think what you guys have done is great. When I went to Latin school, there were 42 kids in my class 6 class, and only 6 of us graduated after the 6 years. It wasn't such a pleasant place. There were 0 clubs. There were some sports teams, but there were 0 clubs. we were all boys, which was awful. Every time I went to a dance, I had to go to the bathroom during a ladies' choice because nobody chose me, which is still the story of my life. Anyways, the notion of making it, and I'm sure few people flunk out. I mean, some people transfer, I'm sure. Was very, very harmful. And we would get great, I once got a 9 in chemistry, and you needed to get a 55 average to pass the year. It was awful. Every Thursday I came home and cried to my mother, and my mother said, "Oh, try it for another week." Before I know it, it was 6 years ago. It's so important that everybody has an opportunity to get education. And I, like you, they had master like you, I was the first in my family to go to college, etc. So I don't think I'd be where I am today if it wasn't for Latin school. And everybody should have that opportunity.
We have a question. Over to Howie, who's here.
Hi, thank you guys, first of all. Just want to say we're in a better place today because of you guys and the work that you've done. So thank you for that. I guess my question though stems from the fact that similar to Professor Holper, I and my kids live in a community where we will lose seats. We are losing seats. And I guess so I constantly have the same conversations that Mary has. And it's hard, right? It's a hard conversation to have. And I guess my question for you is, so one of my children, probably one of my children is white, one of my children is African. And one of the reasons we moved back to the city from the suburbs was the hope that they both possibly go to one of these schools. And one of my children was homeless for a part of her life, but she won't be getting the credits because she's now part of our family. I guess what's happening to the children who maybe used to get those seats? What are they doing? Like what schools are they going to? And then I guess what has gone into the thought of maybe increasing the number of seats in the school, or creating a fourth school or something? I don't know. I haven't put as much time into this as
That came up. You want to go?
I can start with just the first part of what happened to students. I think one of the reasons I referenced that admissions date being April instead of March is a big reason why I think we need to get on the same track as parochial and independent school admissions, because I think there are folks of all racial backgrounds who made decisions because they had to hedge their bets. And so I know that and there have only been a couple years, so it's hard to give you a lot of information about what folks are doing. But some folks stayed in their K-8 schools, some in BPS, some folks went to independent schools of all types, parochial or private, etc. And I would say that those were the most of the paths for folks who were already in BPS: stay in their school or go to school outside of the district, whether it's charter, etc. The first year of this policy, especially because we notified folks late, we were actually under enrolled for grade 7, which means we are actually, I say we still because, once in a while, it's not my school, it's Mr. Gallagher's school, but I say we in the alum sense. We will admit a larger class of 9th graders because the size of the 9th grade admit is squarely based on the size of that cohort coming in. Because unfortunately, there is no more room for expansion at BLS, at least. We are full, 31 per class, running lean. But we're hopeful that some of the students who maybe had intended or their families had intended for them to attend BLS or another school will have that opportunity from that same cohort who understandably was the most surprised and caught off guard cohort. They really had a plan and thought they understood the system, and it was very dramatically changed. And I have a lot of empathy for that cohort of families. And so we're excited to try to, create a bigger cohort of seats for that same class. So that I'll just leave it at that in terms of what we're seeing with the with where folks are going instead right now.
Yeah, look, we gotta be honest, about kind of the state of Boston Public Schools, reality and perception at this point, right? And, you know, as has been shared, you know, the fact is for many families, especially those who, you know, are having conversations when their children are in 4th and 5th grade about where they're going to high school. It really is, it's like there are only maybe 3 schools, definitely 1 school when it comes to high school, you know, that they think about for their children. We've got to shift that. We have a lot of work to do in the Boston Public Schools to ensure that all of our comprehensive high schools are schools that families would choose, one, but even more importantly, are schools that are delivering every day on a quality education for all of the kids, okay? And so in the education policy space, and again, I'm gonna go back to the literacy piece. I mean, for us as an organization, for me personally, you know, I do believe we need to do more work on the literacy side of the house within Boston Public Schools to help, you know, on one end, the children be better positioned to ready to learn at a higher level. But then 2, structurally, I think we as a society, as a Boston community, need to lean in more deeply to ensure that every high school is getting the support it needs, getting the interventions they need in order to deliver for our kids. Because right now, the choice for many parents who understand this thing, it's parochial, it's private, it's Metco. Those are the choice, homeschooling. Those are the choices that families are making if they don't gain access to these schools. But we need to, from a policy standpoint, place more focus on all of the high schools and not just these 3.
And I do want to just sort of follow up on Joe's question. So it's interesting because I've talked about this topic with so many people, and one of our alums who's a BLS, he's like, I grew up in East Boston. I grew up totally poor. Now that I've got kids that are nearing this, I have arrived. I'm a partner in a law firm. Like, I want to move back to East. Like, I'm actually trying to leave. He's like, am I gonna like, he was like, I feel like I'm incentivized to move back to the track 1 instead of track 8. And I've definitely talked to other families who, like, you know, parents born outside of the United States had a really tough like immigration experience, grew up poor, and now they're like, now we're in tier 8. Our kids get the, you know, like sort of feeling like we finally made it, we finally arrived, and yet like the door is not opened in the same way to our kids as, you know, and we like strived and did everything we were supposed to do as the immigrant parents. So I have definitely heard that conversation over and over. And let me tell you, I've also heard other conversations in reading the court cases, because like, even though I'm not an affirmative action constitutional person, I felt like in preparation for this panel, I have to read the court cases. And so reading it, it's like, even just like the plaintiffs and the sort of starting point is like, those seats were ours. They were ours. And I'm like, no, they weren't. They were yours. They were for any student who had a B average and the, you know, right amount of scoring, whatever. And no, it didn't belong to anybody. Nobody has an entitlement to these seats. There are more seats than there are more people qualified than who can take the seats, but they didn't belong to anybody. And I think we have to shift the presumption of like, those were ours. And I get that because I have talked to families who moved out of Boston because of this, like, well, now my kids can't go to BLS, like, I'm out of here. And it's like definitely coming from those belong to us.
And also, it does also support that we should, at some time fairly soon, once the new policy, permanent policy has some data, to really look at potential kind of unintended data elements that may have come from the policy. You know, I think just talking to tier 8 families, it is very true that they're, you know, almost double the applicants in one tier from another. And so it is a very different experience to be a parent in that tier than another tier that actually guarantee you exam school seats because there aren't as many applicants that fill up the tier. Now, all of that speaks to some of the points that have already come up. But that said, I think that especially this is why I brought up the 10 points, if it turns out that a policy that we were trying to prevent schools from being totally blocked from admissions has actually blocked other schools from admissions completely, I think that bears looking at. Because there may have been some overcorrection in terms of all of the efforts that we were trying to do, potentially just needing examination. But I completely agree that it is premature and hasty and unnecessary to change one's residence or geographic status so that their child may be saved from a poor educational experience. I think widening the portfolio is important. And then also remembering that exam schools also educate already 25% of the entire Boston public high school community. All of my colleagues who were school leaders of other schools would say, how much more do you intend to encroach on the rest of the population? Like, you can't keep adding seats. I mean, it does have a dramatic effect on the remaining schools. And so I think also opening folks' minds to schools outside of this 3 as well as the other 2. I think that perspective that my fellow alum had there, that, you know, there's only one school, is a major problem because there's a lot of great things.
Well, and I would say there aren't only 3 schools.
Right, exactly.
There are lots and lots of others, including the Quincy Upper. I live across the street from it. I'm literally like, wow, that would be convenient. Right there, right across the street.
Okay, we have run out of time. I actually would like to end with one perhaps controversial comment that can keep you all thinking about these issues, which is that there is some quite rigorous research that suggests that exam schools actually do not have a significant effect on children's likelihood of going to college, likelihood of graduating from college, or the rigor of the college degree, the college that they attend. So although many people who have attended the schools feel that it changed their lives, there's actually rigorous evidence to suggest that much of that is a selection effect, that the types of students who go to those schools will be successful in many different environmental contexts. I thank you all for coming.
Really illuminating, informative, really exciting conversation. And to Tanisha and Rachel, thank you. We applaud them and the effort and the rigor to this.